And I'd like to begin with a very warm welcome to the panel here. Welcome. Great to have you on board. Just a brief intro. Nandan, I often say you don't need any introduction, but I'm going to anyway. Co-founder and chairman of Infosys, and obviously you have your charitable and non-profit organizations focused on education, which we can talk about your passion about later. Anshu Jain, welcome. President of Cantor Fitzgerald, an interesting space, somebody with their finger on the pulse of the finance sector, trading, global markets, something that's very prone and actually benefits from disruption right now, I'd say. And third, but of course not least, I'm very, very happy to introduce Tom Friedman, award-winning, acclaimed author, reporter, and columnist. Now, here in Davos, I don't need to really introduce myself. I seem to sort of pale into significance, but I am a BBC editor, journalist, broadcaster. I've been here several years in Davos now. Probably, I think it's my third or fourth time. I sort of lost count. They kind of roll into each other, but at the same time, I have to say, it feels a little different, this one. Each one feels a little bit more progressive. This one, actually, I think, feels a bit more optimistic in some ways, despite President Trump and Greta Thunberg on stage and various other trade rows with various chancellors and treasury secretaries. Sometimes from my perspective, I feel Davos has been awash with problems waiting for solutions. And then another perspective, I wonder, actually, is Davos now about solutions looking for problems? And that is something I'm going to touch on later. But one thing is clear. The potential of technology. And it's not just, we're talking about big enterprises, across small business. It's something that actually is having a really big societal effect. And one thing I take away from this Davos, and actually just being in a broadcaster as big as the BBC, is how technology affects every single bit of our lives, work, rest, and play. It's no longer about big enterprise. Big tech now, big technology companies, including Infosys, are no longer about just serving customers and businesses. It's about value, and it's about worth, it's about trust. And on that note, actually, I'm going to throw open my first sort of opening question to Tom. Now, Tom, you're obviously known to many people in the audience as an author for your books. And I know here, these two are no strangers, Nandan and Tom. They've known each other for a long time. And actually, your book was born out, your book, which is The World is Flat, was born out of a conversation, which was born out of a friendship. And the title itself, you know, it's a bit of food for thought, The World is Flat. What I want to know is your thoughts and views when you wrote that book and the ideas that came out when you wrote it. What's changed? What's changed now? Is the world still flat, Thomas?
Great to be here with Infosys and to share the stage. My relationship with Nandan has been so rich and enriching. And so I'm actually thinking about that question right now, Chu. And this is sort of how I think about it from 30,000 feet that maybe can frame what will come next. So I think that the world, if you look back, you know, you could say in the last 500 years, we've had three great releases of energy that were differentiated. The difference of degree, there was a difference in kind. First was obviously the printing press. And the second was when capitalism met the Industrial Revolution. And the third is what we're going through, I would argue, right now. Now, when capitalism met the Industrial Revolution, it was such a disruptive event, blowing us out of the agrarian and feudal era, that it took us about 100 years to find our balance. We had world wars, we had all of these things. We eventually found our way to get the best out of it and cushion the worst through something we called in America the welfare state, the New Deal, and Europeans called it social democracy. And India and Russia and China, everyone had their version of it. And it was a set of, one could say, walls and floors that would allow people to get the best out of this incredible release of energy and cushion the worst. And politics over the last 70 years was basically very binary between left and right. And it was really a story of one side thought the wall should be a little higher and the floor thicker, and the other side thought the wall should be a little lower and the floor thinner. And that made for left-right politics. And left-right politics were very binary and very stable for 70 years. It was capital versus labor, big government, high regulation, small government, low regulation, open to trade, closed to trade, open to immigration, more closed to immigration, open to new social norms, gay marriage, transgender rights, closed to new social norms, and in recent years, green versus growth. And every party in the industrial world in the OECD pretty much lined up pretty consistently along one of those streams or the other, until about 5 or 6 years ago. And you may have noticed that pretty much every party in the industrial world has blown up in the last 5 or 6 years. Okay? The British Tory party has blown up. A lot of them have kept their label still, but they've actually blown up inside. The Conservative Party in England is a very different party than it was a decade ago. The Labour Party has become a Marxist party. The Liberal Party disappeared. France is the only country in the world that has a president, actually with no party, and an opposition with no leader. Italy and Ukraine are ruled by former comedians. The Israeli Labour Party, which founded the country, has pretty much disappeared. And the biggest party in Israel now is a party that didn't exist a year ago, or a year and a half ago. And Israel is in the process of its third election in 6 months with this cast of characters trying to get a coalition. The Republican Party has become a cult of personality, and the Democrats have blown up, but they just don't know it. They'll find out if they're in power. So something pretty interesting is going on. Every party in the industrial world is blowing up. By the way, India's parties, same is true of Congress. I think you could say the BJP. Germany's parties are in free fall. So I've actually been stepping back and saying, well, what's actually going on here? And I would argue that what is going on is that this third release of energy that we're now in the midst of is reshaping politics everywhere. So this third release of energy is a simultaneous acceleration in the three largest forces on the planet, which I call the market, Mother Nature, and Moore's Law. So we are living through a simultaneous acceleration in climate change. That's actually a natural release of energy that we're having to deal with. We're going through a climate change in technology. Machines are acquiring the attributes of human beings. And we're going through a climate change in globalization. We're going from an interconnected world to an interdependent world. And what these three simultaneous accelerations are doing, it is such a powerful release of energy that it is blowing up all of these traditional parties because it's reshaping the world, and this is the answer to your question. The world isn't just flat now. The world is fast, fused, and deep, okay? So fused, what globalization and the climate change are doing, they are fusing our fates now at a degree they have never been before. I was just in New Zealand, breathing the air of Australia 2,500 miles away. In the old days, if you had bad weather and I had good weather, I said, too bad, you're really sorry about that hurricane. We now know that your behavior may be causing my hurricane. We are fused now by the climate in totally different ways. We are fused by technology and globalization in totally different ways. The world's also getting incredibly fast now, and the pace of change obviously accelerating at a speed, scope, and scale we've never seen before, and it's going deep. Deep. You may have noticed we're all suddenly using the word deep. Deep fake, deep state, deep mind, deep research, deep medicine. Nobody declared it, but suddenly we all reached for a word, the same word, because we intuited that technology now is going so deep into places I never imagined before. I can now fake your visage at a depth of precision unimaginable 5 years ago. I can toggle your DNA. I can hit your atom. I can go so deep into you. And we all are sensing this, so we grasp for a word to explain this difference of degree that was a difference in kind. And I'm a big believer in popular culture. And you may have noticed the song that won the Oscars last year was by Lady Gaga. It was called Shallow. But the main verse is, I'm off the deep end, watch as I dive in. I can never reach the shore, crash through the surface where they can't hurt us. We're far from the shallow now. Oh baby, we are far from the shallow now, okay? So the world is getting Fused, fast, and deep. Now, why is this blowing up parties? Well, the reason is, and this is why my book is called Quantum Politics, because what's actually happening in the political world is mirroring what is happening in the world of compute. So traditional compute was binary, or classical computing is binary. It's based on bits that were either in the state of 0 or 1. And if you could toggle very fast through transistors 1 billion bits at the same time, you generated compute and storage. Okay? Quantum computing, so traditional classical computing is like flipping a quarter. If you can flip it 1 billion times a second, you can generate a lot of bits. Quantum computing is like spinning a quarter. And you actually produce qubits that are in multiple states at the same time. And if you can create an algorithm that can constructively interfere them, you create massively more compute. And what I would argue is that in a fast, fused, and deep world, you now have to be in multiple states at the same time. So let me close by giving the example of Infosys, because Ravi and I had an amazing conversation this afternoon, and I was actually out there just a few months ago to see this. In the old days, if I'm the government, non-done employed, and I educated people, and non-done employed them, thank you very much. And we are in a very binary state. Now, with the speed of change, there's no way that non-done, that I can educate people at the speed, scope, and scale he needs. So non-done is now an employer and an educator at the same time. He's in multiple states of this world, okay? In a deep world, we'll use non-done as an example again, non-done is innovating. In the old days, he innovated, I regulated. He's now innovating so fast and deep, I can't possibly catch him, okay? There was a story in the New York Times last week. We had leaked emails from the FAA and Boeing. It was a Boeing, basically. And a Boeing engineer was talking about his FAA regulator. And he said that guy was so out of touch that watching him trying to regulate me was like watching a dog watching television. Okay? All right? Okay. So obviously this can't last. Okay, that's Senator from Utah asking Mark Zuckerberg, Mr. Zuckerberg, if you give your product away for free, how do you make money? That's the regulator talking to the innovator. So we have to now get regulation through a totally new third-party approach. And lastly, with Fused, our fates are now fused. You look at U.S.-China relations. I mean, we're now competitors, partners, rivals, everything. So the reason these parties are blowing up is that they cannot manage this complex world where they have to be in multiple states at the same time. So they've blown up inside, they've kept their brands outside, and they basically are saying that they've opted for cults of personality, all of them, in this transition before they figure out a new way of doing things.
I mean, what a vision. That's not a release of energy. I don't know what it is. Tom, I want to know, contextually, Anshu, can I say, I'm going to come to Nandan, but in this world where the company is now the skills maker, it's not the government, it's not the state, in this sort of transfer of worlds and being active in multiple states. In your industry, which we've seen disruption in, what do you make of that? What are you part of this sort of multiple state world? It's confusing. Where do you see your role and your industry?
So thanks, Joe. But before I say anything else, Nandan, thanks for having me here. My gratitude, though, has dimmed considerably post the fact that I now realize I have to follow that. Okay? So I'll just point out that till he was doing strategy, vision, original content, I was aware of all that. Lady Gaga, really? I'm now supposed to compete with that? So here's what my dad taught me. Don't even try. Right? So I will define my own rules. I'll go really prosaic and boring and talk about disruption and its impact on finance. And I'll have you think of that as the dog that didn't bark. There's a fabulous Sherlock Holmes story where all of us that are Watson Sherlock Holmes fans will remember he solves the problem by basically pointing out that there's a dog that didn't bark, and that anomaly leads to, those that haven't read it, Silver Blaze, I recommend it. Why do I start with that? So here's an industry which ought to have been disrupted 20 years ago, right? And if I think about the way, I'll just take a simple analogy, music. So my 12-year-old boy turns to me, and this is about 15 years ago and says, Dad, what are you doing? I used to go to B&H. I would love looking at CDs. I would buy the CDs, bring them home. I had a multiple CD changer. The entire value chain, the labels, the attractiveness of the packaging, B&H's margins, how the artist got paid, was a certain way. Act 2, Scene 1. 5 years later, iTunes. 5 years later, Spotify. Completely different. Entire value chain, totally different. My user experience considerably enhanced. The label's gone. I don't have to go further on. Now let's think about the way you get advice when you want to buy another company. What happens when you want to move dollars into pounds? What happens if you want to actually store your money and withdraw it? The same. Nothing has changed. What happened? Now, many of you are thinking that's not true at all. Banks are using all kinds of technology now. Yes, storage, movement, computation has all changed. So the tools which the finance companies are using are considerably more advanced. But let's take a look at this. Look at the wallet which is combined by the combined wallet of the financial services industry. Who had it 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago? Who has it today? The same guys. The identities have changed a bit. 3 American banks now make 75% of it all, but it's still the banks. It's still the asset managers. It's BlackRock. It's Fidelity. It's Blackstone. So what happened? I think this is a question which we need to ponder, because the answer to this, I believe, will presage the next wave in our industry and a very different use case experience for you. So what happened was the global financial crisis, and I'll take the liberty of slightly exaggerating to make my point. Regulators came to a couple of conclusions. One, they came to the conclusion that depositors have to be protected at all costs. Anyone who takes money in has to be regulated in a totally different way. In fact, regulated to the point where his or her ROE is going to plummet. The cost of compliance and regulation that will be imposed on it is going to be so onerous, okay, that we can never have an '08 moment again. The inevitable outcome of that, of course, is there's a massive moat around financial services. You can't take deposits. You don't want to take deposits. Why are Google and Apple and others not jumping into finance? They're right not to. Their multiples will plummet. The level of intrusion that they will receive. Can you imagine monopolies in my industry? I look with envy at big tech. One company dominates 89% of all market share.
Facebook tried, though.
So finance has not been allowed that. Finance itself has been stodgy and has not been entrepreneurial, hasn't met customer demand. Think about your use experience when you look at your money, look at your investments, even robo-advisory. Compare any of that to your use experience in any other industry. So we've done a shoddy job. By the way, we've been so busy being regulated, worrying about markets and all the rest of it, there is an alibi. But in my view, all of this will change. And I'll tell you where it's changing. It's changing in emerging markets. So I'll take India, and I'm not complimenting my host here, but just some numbers. Total population, 1.2 billion. 10 years ago, and I'll get these numbers slightly wrong, so pardon me. Internet access, as defined by any metric, 50 million, 60 million?
Less.
Mobile phones show up, basic smartphone technology comes in, 20, 30 million becomes 100 million, 200 million, 300 million. Nandan introduces the UID, a biometric identification system, which gives every Indian a unique identity, which leapfrogs India way above everyone else. 1 billion registered.
1.25.
1.25. The UPI stack comes in, and now guess what happens? The total number of people that have been adopted by financial services was tiny. The unbanked who were borrowing money from traditional money lenders, who were charging them 30, 40, 50%, because compound interest is not an obvious concept for most people, hence they were getting ripped off. Suddenly, in come fintech companies and say, okay, I now know who you are, you have a mobile phone, I will bypass the banks and I'll lend money to you directly. Guess what? This isn't happening nearly at the same pace in the developed markets. These companies are now doing really well, and the use case has benefited hugely. So I'll pause simply by saying I'm very confident that the next 5 to 10 years will see the much needed democratization of finance the way we've seen music, leisure, and retail.
So on that music, leisure, and retail, Nandan, I'm keen to know, because I know, education, skills, scaling technology, from what Andrew's just said, what's going on? Can his industry benefit from yours? Where do you see your role in IT service in IT, as a chairman, as an educator, as a skills maker?
Yeah. Well, I think, I've been in this business a long time. It's, I hate to admit it, it's something like 40 years. And I have never seen so much change, so much disruption, and so many companies grappling with the same set of issues. How do they deal with digital challenges? How do they deal with changing their mindsets? How do they deal with training the people? How do they deal with reinventing themselves in a much more, digital way? So I think this is really a very, very different time. But it also means that companies will have to reinvent themselves fairly dramatically and become far more agile, far more responsive, far more real time. And all this is really going to drive massive change across the board. And particularly on the education front, I think the whole requirement of lifelong learning is now going to be the whole thing. It's no longer about getting a degree and then hoping to have a job. You have to learn all the time. And you're in a world where new skills will be required and old skills will get obsolete very fast, which means it's not about what you know, but how good you are at learning new things. So I think our whole learning infrastructure will change. It's no longer about schools and colleges, but how do we create continuous on-demand learning, just in time, in capsules, pick it up and use it and so on. And some of the work we are doing is of that type. So I think all these things are going to change. And unfortunately, if people are not able to deal with this change, they are going to get left behind.
And when you say people are going to get left behind, are you pointing the finger at or looking at government? Are you looking at other companies?
No, I think in the world of quantum politics, quantum government, whatever, I think the ability of the traditional institutions to respond to this change is very low. And therefore, we'll have to radically rethink how organizations and people, respond. And certainly from a people point of view, we have to take charge of our lives because there's no other way we're going to get there.
And in terms of an organisation, I'd like to know from you, Anshu, what your new recruits in Cantor Fitzgerald, how much has that changed? We were talking about your children and Spotify and their education. Today, those coming in, how are they going to cope? How are they going to be equipped with the right skills if quantum leaps are happening, as Tom is talking about?
It's something I worry about. I worry about
Really?
this for my kids, in that the gap between state of the art and what I knew when I came out of school, and I was, reasonably technically proficient, but I was probably 75th percentile, and what state of the art was measurable. I could sort of understand most things that were happening. I think of my kids, and they're reasonably all right academically, but there's no comparison between state of the art and where they are. So there is an agility, there is an impatience among the millennials, there's the attention span of a mosquito, which is good, okay? That will hold them in good stead. They don't hold the same job for more than 2 years, they want new experiences, they want to be asset light. Those of us that have millennials, you know what it's like, right? So all that's socially very good. Technically, my views are pretty straightforward. I think we need to really get math and engineering and computing really back in schools again in palatable, easily digestible ways. Because, our kids are just not, at least I think for most of us, our kids are not. Kids from tough backgrounds who have no choice, the Chinese, Indian, Korean, Russian immigrant kids, are the ones. I went to my son's undergrad school, and it was really interesting. When you go into the English history departments, you see one set of demographics. Moment you go into STEM, it's totally different. Very few girls, lots of Russians, lots of Chinese, a few Indians. That's what it is. Those are the facts. Go sample the stats. Now, that is a worrying stat, because if, in fact, Tom, you're right, which I believe you are, I think the base level skill required to compete in that world, or even understand that world, our kids will need to do a lot of work to catch up.
So in that context, Tom, I'm keen to hear your views. The skills we're talking about, they're not the skills that will be relevant in 10 years' time. And we were talking about leaps in AI and so forth, and artificial intelligence. A lot of the jobs today that we think about, that we talk about, are they going to be obsolete? What are the skills that are going to be valuable in the future, in your mind?
Well, I think the most You know, I had in the world is flat. I had a equation. I said that PQ plus CQ is always greater than IQ. So you give me a young person with a high passion quotient and a high curiosity quotient, I'll take them over the kid with a high intelligence quotient 7 days a week. Because PQ and CQ is about really loving to learn, always learning, experimenting. If I have a high IQ, I'm going to be, I know it all. And so that person's much more likely to come up with something new. I think the STEM thing is crested because software is going to do a lot more STEM stuff. And coming up with design, Ravi and I were talking about, who invented Airbnb? There were 2 grads from the Rhode Island School of Design. They weren't technologists, They saw a niche in the market. They saw an opportunity. So I think you're going to see education really get revamped. Where my daughter's actually starting a K-12 school in San Francisco. It's called Redbridge. You can see it on redbridge.org, redbridgesf.org, and her whole the whole structure of the school is you do not move up by turning a year older. You do not even move up by regurgitating back to the teacher a certain body of knowledge. You actually move up by IL, independence level. And she's reverse engineered down to kindergarten. What does an independent learning kindergartner look like? What does an independent learning first grader look like? What does an independent learning, and all the way through. And you only move up, and say, by advocating to move up. So when you're done, by the time you graduate, you're right there, the kind of person an Infosys or Cantor Fitzgerald wants, who is a lifelong learner. That you've actually had that inculcated into you from kindergarten, not what you have today, which is when that person shows up at Infosys now, they have to spend. I was talking to Astro Teller about Google X. He says, "Well, we spend the first year getting unlearning people." I said, "No, you mean learning people?" He said, "No, unlearning people." Okay, and so there's not a lot of time, and what a waste of money. So the whole system has to really get revamped.
And the school you're talking about in San Francisco, I'd say that's probably quite unique.
Oh, yes,
and probably
it's
quite
independent.
unusual. So for the rest of the planet, does that worry you? Do you have to unlearn people, Nanda?
No,
when
no,
they
I-
come?
I-
and
no, I
how do you
think-
see that in your educational
Obviously,
charity?
if people have been brought up to learn by rote or study their way through, and this requires much more intuition, much more passion, much more creativity. Yes, they have to learn these new things. But I think that's where the learning paradigm itself will change. I think the kind of school that his daughter has started and many other initiatives are really about creating a new way of learning. But how do you scale that up? That's the challenge. How do you get 1 billion people to be on that way of thinking?
And that's something that you don't have answers to.
No, actually, we do.
That's right. Yeah. You should ask.
But
they
anyway,
do.
I don't want to
But
give up.
that's what I'm pushing at. What,
Yeah,
what?
so the work we do at Xstep, my wife Rohini is here, and we have basically funded the development of a complete new digital infrastructure to make learning on tap at scale. And we have now about few 100 million children who will potentially have access to this infrastructure. And so it's all about making sure that instead of you going to the learning comes to you at your time, of your choice, of your standard, and you can quickly measure your progress on that. And what you learn today will be different from what you learn tomorrow. It's very agile.
Agile. Well, agile is a word that we've been using a lot, but agile. I wanna talk about risk, and I don't want to talk in a negative way, but are there risks to the pace, to the release of energy you're talking about? It sounds a sort of scary place. What are the risks of the development of skills, the way of politics, the way companies are going, the way disruption is going? And I'm not just talking about big tech. I'm talking about the risks, because not everybody is in the place or is as fortunate as maybe your daughter in this incredible school. I mean, that sounds amazing. Or benefiting from your ventures in education. What I'd like to ask you, Andrew, what do you think are the risks if we're to believe that we're living in this very fast-paced world?
I worry. The single thing in my mind which has driven the schism in the last 10 years is this feeling of inequality. Inequality has always been around. It hasn't been as central to the debate. All of a sudden, there seems to be a unanimous agreement that the world's unfair and getting more unfair. And the politics that we've seen emanate from that are hard to argue with. So if we trace through, and by the way, over the last 3 days, there's always stuff you learn in Davos. The tech company bosses give terrific answers to what I'm about to argue against. They will all tell you that, no, this technology actually is going to benefit everyone and the benefit case will overwhelm. No, let's go to the heart of it. Even the example that Tom used. A few will get very wealthy. Many more will help those few get very wealthy and so will get quite wealthy themselves. But just this piece of it, that kind of entrepreneurial zeal which allows an Airbnb to be invented, would we really expect that to be 1 million kids coming out of school? No. When I was talking about my STEM issue, Tom, it was a pyramid. The top will always be the top. Steve Jobs or the creator of these wonderful new models, of course, they're going to use these tools beautifully. And I love your CQ point, that curiosity point particularly. But I believe that is the preserve of the few. Now let's go down the hundreds of millions of kids around the world who will be graduating. This is technology and this is a way of working which is very different from the world I came into 20, 30 years ago. You could teach much more easily, and if you came with not much of a background, the things which I did could have been taught relatively easily. Even curiosity, entrepreneurial ability, disruption, these are very refined, high-end things. So my concern, and I'm not smart enough to have the answer for it, is if state leaders, business leaders cannot think through the second, third, fourth order implications of this incredible technology which is coming, I think the fruits of this particular revolution will be far more asymmetrically divided, and we start in a post-quantitative easing world, which is already very uneven and perceived to be very unfair. We better crack this code quickly, simultaneous to this value creation, because if that cake gets divided unequally again, I fear for the consequences.
And actually, in Davos here, you have to say that it is a bit of a privileged environment, and it's good to come back.
We'll all benefit, no question. We're all about to do very well.
You're about to do very well, and I have to mention that you come to the snowy alpine resort and the things we talk about. There is it's heightened inequality sometimes. Can I now just open this out, because I would like to get some questions. There's a lot that we've chewed over and a lot of food for thought here. Can I just throw this out to the audience for a question? I mean, does anybody have a view about the risks we're talking about here and what you'd like to know from these three kind of thought leaders about where we're going?
Just a question about the argument that a lot of tech companies, particularly social media companies, use to describe themselves as neutral platforms. Do you think that argument still stands, or do you see a shift happening in that debate? Should tech companies view themselves differently and change the way they cultivate and look after the content that's flowing through their networks?
Tom has
Thomas,
thought
I
about
think
it.
that's for you.
Well, I work for something that for most of its life, the New York Times, was printed on a dead tree, okay? And on this dead tree, we had people who were called reporters and people who were called advertisers. And then around the dead tree, we had government regulators and editors. And what the editor said was that if I, as the reporter, got something wrong on the dead tree, I had to correct it. And what the regulator said was if I wanted to run a political ad on the New York Times dead tree, I had to identify who I was, what my source of income was, and according to the New York Times rules, stay within the broad boundaries of the truth. Then along came Facebook. And Facebook said, oh, no, we are not a dead tree. We are a platform. We're something totally different. We don't need any of your editors. And we don't need any of your regulators, but we want all of your readers and all of your advertisers. And we said, what? And they said, trust us. Trust us. And we trusted them, and they completely screwed us. A short history of journalism in the last 5 years. So I have extremely strong views on this. I don't believe that being a platform that basically uses New York Times content all the time to lure people onto the platform, either to arouse them negatively or positively, and you have 2.4 billion readers now around the world, you are not excused from managing
One
content
question.
on your platform. And if it's too big to do that, then shrink it. And what Mark Zuckerberg has never said, he has never looked into a camera and said, I will take my stock to $1 if that's what's required to make sure that Facebook is not the engine of another rigged election or perverted election in the United States of America. And until I see that, I'm not a fan, and I'm not on Facebook.
Another question. We're coming to the end, so can we have...
Fantastic discussion. I think great that Davos Day 3, you're still able to inject some energy into us. So thank
Completely
you.
on battery power. Go ahead.
So a reflection and possibly a challenge. I went to CES first week of Jan, and CES is, of course, Davos on steroids. And, there's like millions and millions of square feet of technology after technology, all that can, of course, promise to change your life. But I was so disappointed to see that there was absolutely no conversation or space for conversation about how this technology is actually exploiting human weakness. Our addiction to our phones, the social isolation, the attention deficit, the fact that confirmation bias happens, you only get fed what you want to read, and so on and so forth. There was not even a start of a conversation of what is this really doing to humanity, to connection, to compassion, to empathy. I mean, not even an iota of it. So as, big thought leaders, how are you advocating and pushing to put human-centric technology, importantly, in the middle of all of this?
Tom.
But I'd love all...
Now, again, you're asking fabulous questions to which I don't think anyone has answers. My terrible beginning answer is that it's not subject to regulation. Those are the sorts of things which no one has the power to do anything about. So then it's only one of two things. Either the creators of that technology better develop a conscience, because you can't get them to worry about attention deficit disorder. Sorry, it's of the things we can stop them from doing, sharing data is one thing, but getting your 9-year-old to not keep looking at his phone every 14 seconds, you can't legislate that. So something has to happen either from them, or we have to voluntarily do something. These are awful answers. I agree with your statement completely. Some of the behavior which we've all seen our friends exhibit on Facebook or Instagram are just cringeworthy. Maybe we do it ourselves. The endless posting of happy experiences when you know the full picture of that individual isn't that. How many of our friends have concocted realities there and angles and all that stuff? I mean, it's just feeding narcissistic, crazy behavior. So, agree with you. Can't even begin to frame an answer.
I'm a little more, first of all, I love the way you framed your question. It was a beautiful riff, just as someone who likes to riff. That was really well done. I sort of think about this in American baseball terms. The first inning of the internet was just fantastic. This is so cool. I can connect, I can buy, I can shop, I can do all this. The first inning was awesome. Then we had the second inning, which began with Mark Zuckerberg saying, that's crazy that the Russians used our platform. And then discovering, everything. We saw all the dark side, facial recognition, stuff, authoritarian governments. Second inning's been awful, frankly. I think we might be entering the third inning now, where, to Anshu's point, I was meeting with, two things. Airbnb, I happen to be very close to the guys who founded that company. I followed it from the beginning, so I know what's going on there. They just announced they're going to be giving shares at their IPO to their hosts. So each longtime host will now have shares in Airbnb. So it won't just be, so it's a different model. Who knows how it'll work? It'll be complicated. They'll make mistakes. But he's actually they've heard his point and said, no, we're going to have a different model. I was talking to another leader of a giant fintech company, not a bank, but a fintech company, who was saying, that last year they decided, they discovered a lot of their outsourced personnel were living below the minimum wage, that literally could, and they gave them a raise. Then they discovered, actually, which you see now a lot of cities in America, because of the costs of healthcare, education, transport, and housing have all been going up everywhere. That's actually the core problem here. that you have teachers, my daughter's school in San Francisco, you have teachers and policemen who can no longer afford to live in the city where they are public employees. Well, that's just not going to last. And so he's actually now starting a whole new program of profit sharing around a certain minimum. And so maybe I just ran into the two wrong people. Or maybe the message is getting through after all this conversation. And so maybe the third inning, and maybe Facebook will come to a different, we saw where Twitter came to a different place, Google's come to a different place. So I think these conversations are really healthy, and it's iterative, and it's going to go back and forth. But the third inning could be kind of interesting.
Yeah, I think there are three sort of original sins which brought us here, right? The first was the internet was not designed for commerce. It was meant to be a technical platform, and therefore the only way to make money on the internet was through advertising, and then that led to the whole data and surveillance capitalism and all that. So that was one original sin, which was there was no way to make money, and therefore the money was made from data, and therefore all this. The second thing was the Communications Decency Act of 1996, Section 230, gave a full waiver to platforms of any intermediate liability, which is that, we are a platform. So I think unlike media or television, which had these constraints of censorship and, or rather the legal obligations, there were no obligations by law. The US government passed a law in 1996, and that led to platforms doing what they want. The third thing is the net neutrality essentially gave a free pass for these over-the-top players to ride on the investments done by telecom companies and grow big. So these three things need to be corrected.
I wonder where we'll be this time next year, if we're all here in Davos, where this conversation will go. Because actually, very, very thoughtful note to end. And at this stage, I know we're all dashing, and you've probably got more dinners, talks, and things to go to. But Nandan, Anshu, and Tom, can I just thank you? I mean, I think you'll agree that was a very thought-provoking conversation, and it's ending, but I kind of want phase 2 to be, maybe we can organise it in London or somewhere else. Maybe video conference. I'd like to just get the next chapter from you all. But thank you very much, and thank you for being
Thank you.
an engaged audience today.